You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 17th of April, 2025, on Monocle Radio.
Ukraine is now at the table, but is it still on the menu? Greece joins in Europe's general tooling up, but who are they really concerned about? And the possible demise of the high school field trip. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Evdokia Lemperi and James Rogers will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from has winged its way from Denver. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller and I am joined today by Evdokia Lemperi, UK correspondent for ERT, Hellenic Broadcasting Corporation, and James Rogers, Associate Professor of International Journalism at City University of London. Hello to you both.
Hi, Andrew.
Hello.
Evdokia, welcome to the Monocle Daily. Your first time on this show. Introduce yourself to our listeners if you would. Who are you and how did you get here?
Who am I? Who am I? My name is Evdokia Lemperi. And as you said, Andrew, I'm the UK correspondent for the Hellenic Broadcasting Corporation. That's ERT in Greece. It's the equivalent in a smaller scale of the BBC here.
Okay.
So people can understand. It's the public broadcaster that people pay for.
Have you been here long enough that you had to explain Brexit to Greek listeners?
Absolutely, yes.
That must have been fun.
Oh, gosh. I thought I forgot about it, or I'm trying to.
I think the phrase, oh gosh, would have covered it, actually, just like that could have been your daily update. James, a familiar voice to our listeners at this point, you have been traipsing around this country, but as I understand it, not really strictly for journalistic purposes.
Not really strictly for journalistic purposes, Andrew. As you know, I'm quite a keen sports fan. April is one of my favourite months of the year, being the culmination of the English football team season and the beginning of the English cricket season. So I've been keeping myself busy watching the progress of the end of the season of one sport, which I love, and seeing the beginning of the season of another. And it has been an unusually nice April here in England, and I've already been to see 2 full days of county cricket, one in Essex to the east of London and one in South London here at the Oval.
Are you then one of that dwindling cohort of tragic but faintly admirable weirdos who still actually goes to see county cricket?
I do when time permits, and as you know, it does need quite a lot of time. For listeners who don't know, these games last for 4 days, and I have a lot of friends from other countries here in London, and they really can't get it when I say the game lasts for 4 days. It can be really exciting on the 4th day, especially if nobody wins. So it's a bit of a hard sell in some ways, but yes, I am one of those people.
You do basically get, when you go to see county cricket, 4-day county cricket, you basically get a grandstand to yourself, don't you?
Actually, the Oval here in London last week there was 5,000 people, which is not massive by sort of test match or international match standards, but not bad for the first day of a 4-day game. OK,
well, that's probably enough cricket chat, because we do have quite a lot of the non-cricket world tuning in, and they will have not the least idea what we're talking about. So we will begin in Paris, where the future of Ukraine is once again being discussed by the United States and its European allies, if allies they still are, though this time actual Ukrainians, specifically the country's foreign and defence ministers, have been invited to participate in the deliberations. French President Emmanuel Macron is hosting, the US represented by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Ukraine envoy Keith Kellogg and Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, who recently met Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Also attending are a smattering of European foreign ministers. James, first of all, as I count, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, is now 85 days past his 24-hour deadline self-imposed, in which he said he would solve the Ukraine crisis. Do we know what the US plan actually is?
The US plan seems to be for people to stop fighting and that to be the basis of a longer-term peace process, but that has not happened. We've seen actually an escalation in many senses by Russia in the last week or so. As you mentioned, Steve Witkoff met President Putin last Friday to be precise, spoke to him for some 4 hours, according to the Kremlin spokesman. And yet I see that President Zelensky of Ukraine has given a news conference this afternoon in which he is accusing Mr. Witkoff of spreading Kremlin narrative. So I think he's suggesting that these long talks are actually probably perhaps more of a monologue of the kind that Vladimir Putin is often prone to give to foreign visitors, particularly somebody like Mr. Witkoff, who, although he's obviously got considerable success in the New York business world, is still something of a novice at international affairs, particularly the solving of armed conflicts.
Evdoxia, is Europe, do you think, still, for all the jolts the transatlantic alliance has had in the last couple of months, is Europe still clinging to the idea of the United States as its ally of last resort, this idea that they wouldn't really desert us if we needed them?
The European Union starts to take things in their hands, but they cannot. They cannot without US direct military commitment. They don't seem like they can do a lot. This once more looks like a choreography, like a photo op. Once again, we have seen different gatherings of prime ministers, of ministers of defense, of foreign ministers, and it always it's going like circle again and again and again without any substance coming out. We see always Russia escalating their attacks. President Zelensky always saying that, help me, and you don't spread Putin's narrative. And the European Union can do so much. Without the US help and direct military commitment, they cannot do much, I'm afraid. They are trying, they escalate, but it's so much they can do. I can't see them, doing substantial steps towards a solution.
James, if we look at this from Russia's perspective, and this is a country you know well and reported from extensively, is the problem not that if you are Vladimir Putin at this point, stopping fighting arguably causes more problems than it solves? Because first you have the presentational difficulties of going back to your people and saying, well, we've had a good crack at this, but frankly, it doesn't look like it's going to work. And you then have the volatile factor of hundreds of thousands of demobilized, confused, traumatized, and possibly quite angry soldiers coming home.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that a lot of people talk about. And also bear in mind, for the last 3 years, the entire Russian economy has been booming in one sense, but it's been booming because of the war. And that is not the sort of expectations that people are going to be able to keep up. So I think it is very difficult. I think something's often forgotten. Putin has actually conceded very, very, next to nothing in his discussions with the United States. We have also to remember, Russia has formally claimed 4 provinces of Ukraine, 4 regions of Ukraine that it says are now part of the Russian Federation. So it's very, very difficult to imagine that he stops the war without, in a way which he doesn't have full control of these territories, which he doesn't at the moment. The other thing is, of course, there was a possibility where perhaps a year ago he could have said, as you suggest, said, actually, we went to war against what he called the Nazis in Ukraine, or whatever phrase he was going to use. But actually it turned out that we were fighting the whole of the West and NATO. So given that, we did all right. We've got some more territory. We've annexed this and we'll have to settle for that. We've done very well. But I think that sort of moment has passed. Particularly, there's been crowing in the Russian state media about the United States coming around to, as Zelensky would see it, to repeat Russian narratives. So I think Putin is not and he has no incentive to. Remember, he started this war not just to capture part of eastern and southern Ukraine, but to take Kiev and to change the government there. And I think that probably actually remains his longer term objective.
Evdoxia, is there anything to the argument that Europe is still being somewhat timid, perhaps the more so as it worries about whether the United States is still on its side? Because to look at the same scenario from Europe's point of view or from the West's point of view, Russia has thrown pretty much everything it has at a much smaller country for 3 years. It has made really not very much progress, and there doesn't appear any indication that they're going to get much further than they have. The economy, by some measures, is being somewhat hollowed out. Is there not an argument for saying, let's win this thing for Ukraine. Let's give them everything they actually need.
It's a lot at stake at this. Remember, they are all, most of them are members of NATO. And in NATO, you can see other countries as well that they could say no to this initiative. So it's a lot of diplomacy, but as I said, diplomacy without delivery risks becoming performance, which is what we see now. And Ukrainian people deserve so much more than that. And as long as President Trump is not taking action with supporting Ukraine, then we're going to see this dragging, I'm afraid. EU by itself, it's a huge organization. There are many countries in it. Each one of the countries, not all of them are on the same line. We can see Hungary. We can see, different countries can veto some decisions. It's very complicated in the EU. And then there is UK, of course, which is the in-between state, wants to open the gates with EU, but also keep the relationship with the US. They want a trade agreement there. They want to become the Trump's kind of, person or mediator between Ukraine and US. I can't see something concrete coming out of it. Not yet. I can't really visualize anything concrete. The US shows up in Paris with suits, but not soldiers. It's presence only, without promises.
Well, let's move along somewhat, and on a related front to Denmark, which does now appear to be among the more willing of the coalition supporting Ukraine, in that Denmark actually is going to send troops. A few important caveats, however: the Danes will not be armed, they will not be venturing anywhere near any front lines, and indeed won't even be training Ukrainian troops, but learning from them. The Danes have surmised, doubtless correctly, that what Ukrainian soldiers do not by now know about drone warfare is not worth knowing, and have gone to learn firsthand. Russia has harumphed, somewhat predictably by now, that this is a deliberate provocation, and so forth. James, there is possibly a degree of ingenuousness attached to this deployment. We're just going unarmed just to learn about drones. We don't really mean any harm. This isn't a signal of any sort. Before we get on to the possibility that it might be slightly more than that, is this just common sense? Should the armies of NATO, the West, be going to Ukraine to learn from Ukrainians about drone warfare?
Well, that's the history of war is also the history of technological innovation.
Absolutely.
Often. This is a big example in this war has been drone warfare. It's the big thing that people say has changed about warfare. So there's a lot to learn. I mean, I think for the longer term, the fact that the Danish army has decided to do this deployment, albeit with the caveats that you've mentioned, Andrew, shows that they are expecting that these are skills that they will probably need to have in the very near future, very possibly. I mean, it's interesting in the sort of the broader context of Danish history. They largely stayed out of conflicts altogether for most of the 20th century until they started, when they deployed peacekeeping troops to Yugoslavia in the 1990s, the first overseas deployment, I think, probably since the late 19th century. They stayed out. So this is a very much sign of greater military. Denmark, I mean, I spend quite a lot of time there, as you know, I think. So I was actually looking at some of the Danish media reports of this. Denmark is also proposing to extend the draft to conscript women, which they haven't previously done before. So the society is the politicians and the military is preparing society, for the military to be a much bigger presence, and this is clearly part of that.
Doxia, is there a certain amount of theatre here as well from the Danes? This is them demonstrating that Ukraine is our ally. They've invited us. We will go. There's nothing wrong about that. But also, we're not armed and we're not at war and we're not fighting. So what are you going to do about it?
Well, this is a significant step from Denmark. It's not by any chance, of course. It's Denmark that has received President Trump's desire to have Greenland. So it has many readings, so to speak, this movement of Denmark. This is no longer a conflict at Europe's edge. It's being pulled in the middle, into the center of Europe, this intervention. And this could highlight Europe's recalibration of risk and integration of values and versus action. Now, this may be quiet, no weapons, this and that, but it's a significant step. Denmark's putting boots on the ground, even if not in the front line. It is significant. Something changes. And it can blur the boundaries between the supporting and intervening. We saw Putin's reaction already about that. And I think that's deliberate.
I mean, are there risks attached to this from Denmark's point of view and perhaps those of Denmark's allies, James? Because you can imagine what the nightmare scenario is, and Russia has made it clear that, in its view, training centres are legitimate targets, even if it's Ukraine training other people rather than vice versa. What happens if a Russian missile lands on one of these training centres, there are Danish casualties, and Russia says, well, whoops?
Well, interestingly, that's exactly the point that some Danish military analysts have been addressing in the Danish media today, and that exact question was put to one by TV2, the Danish broadcaster that did the interview with the head of the Danish army, Peter Boysen, that's prompted these stories today. And the military analysts are basically saying, if we lose a soldier there, it's a loss we're going to have to take. But I think this works in a number of ways, because they're preparing the population for the possibility that, that scenario may unfold, but also people are thinking, well, what then? Is that going to mean war with Russia? But they're also saying, that will not be the consequence. This is a loss that we're going to have to take. They're stressing the benefits of the Danish army acquiring the expertise from their Ukrainian counterparts they've built up over the years. But interestingly, again, in this interview today, Major General Peter Boysen is saying he's served in the army for 42 years. He's now head of the army. He has never known a time when things are changing so quickly. He says speed is a mindset. You might be interested that mindset is a word that has gone into the Danish language as well.
Evdoxia, do we think it's likely, therefore, that this might be a way of the coalition of the willing gradually accumulating a presence in Ukraine?
Yes, absolutely. I think so. That's the start of it. And this marks a quiet but very seismic shift. Europe stepping past symbolic aid into physical presence now with this. The old firewall between support and intervention is slowly eroding. Denmark isn't just sending troops, it's sending a message. Neutrality has its limits. And this is the big message I think we need to take from this movement. I think it's going to be followed by other countries as well, slowly.
Well, just finally on this and on that thought, James, there's a certain amount, is there not, of, disingenuous hypocrisy in both directions here, in that, and the reporting on this has by now been extensive. Everybody, Russia included, well knows that Western troops have been deployed all along during this conflict, largely special forces operating near or behind the front lines, operating alongside Ukrainian troops. This is not a secret at this point.
Yes, but nor is it sort of publicised in the same way with the head of the army. There's no other head of a Western army who's gone out and said, you know what, our special forces are in Ukraine. Like you say, many people know this or imagine it to be the case. Training, instruction, that kind of thing. But I think, in an age when war is fought through the media as well as on the battlefield, this is quite significant that the head of the army goes out, says this on the record, that this is happening. It's exactly as Evdoxia was saying. It's something significant is happening here in terms of things being crossed. And so I think the fact they've done this so publicly, albeit saying, we're not going to have weapons, when we're going to learn, and so on and so on. I think the fact that this is a sort of public deployment, alongside these semi-clandestine ones, which we imagine have been going on for 3 years and more, I think that is significant.
Well, to Greece now, which is furnishing some detail of what it proposes to spend some of its massive defence budget increase on. Greece has signed an agreement with France to buy 16 Exocet missiles, the current generation of the anti-ship missile made famous by the Falklands War of 1982, where its deployment by Argentina against the Royal Navy strained cross-channel relations somewhat. The presumable point of these missiles is to encourage Greece's historical antagonist Turkey to keep a respectful distance. Last week at the Delphi Economic Forum, I spoke to Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis. I asked him if there was anything Greece could perhaps teach Denmark and Canada about managing relations with a large and volatile NATO ally.
I do believe that, at the end of the day, two things need to happen. On the one hand, Greece needs to present, a very, very credible deterrence in terms of defending our sovereignty and our sovereign rights. And that is why we are heavily investing in modernizing our armed forces. At the same time, one needs to explore pathways towards building a more productive relationship, even if that means not addressing, the complicated underlying issue, which is at the heart of our dispute with Turkey, which is the delimitation of maritime zones in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean, where frankly we have not made any significant progress. So even if we agree to disagree on important issues, that does not mean that we need to be constantly at each other's throats, nor does it mean that we cannot explore opportunities to strengthen our relationship on other fronts.
That was Kyriakos Mitsotakis, Prime Minister of Greece, speaking to me at last week's Delphi Economic Forum. You can hear that whole conversation on the current edition of The Foreign Desk, which you can find on our website. Evdoxia, announcing or confirming this agreement with France, Greece's Defence Minister Nikos Dendias said, Greece does not threaten, but it is threatened. It's fairly clear who he's talking about there. Is that still really the case, do you think?
Yes, it's always the case with Turkey. I'm afraid to say, yes, it's always the case with Turkey. And this is less about weapons. It's more like about reassurance for Greece, to Greeks and to Europe now, in extent. We are the borders, the southeast borders of European Union. Greece, it's reinforcing its shield. That's what the country is doing with all this large amount of armor and weapons and the frigates and all this. In the Eastern Mediterranean, symbolism matters between the two countries, right? And these missiles are more than military hardware. It's symbolism. It's like we are strong and we are here and we can respond and you cannot bully us.
I mean, is it also symbolic in who Greece is buying these weapons from? This is Greece also saying to Turkey, France is basically on our side here. And you allude to this, that Greece has already bought 24 Rafale fighter jets from France, 3 Belhara-class frigates. I think last time there was a significant flare-up between Greece and Turkey, France actually sent ships and planes, and it was fairly clear whose side they were on.
Absolutely. We see that, lastly, the Franco-Hellenic strategic axis is getting stronger and stronger. And they seem to be very, very strong allies with all this last activity that you just said, Andrew. And that sends a clear signal in the Aegean that it's about deterrence, not escalation. And it's not only with France. We know that Greece has now strengthened the ties with Cyprus and Israel, the third part, and with the French support, and with Egypt. And yesterday they made clear the maritime special plan, which will cause now a new, has already caused from Turkey reactions. So we're going to see how this will escalate. I'm afraid that we're going to see some escalation the next days about it.
On this scenario, James, well, if you're looking at this from Greece's position. Should Russia's invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago made Greece possibly a little bit more wary about its situation? Again, all parallels are imperfect, but there we are. You're living next door to a much bigger country with whom you have a certain amount of history and which is run by a pseudo-authoritarian demagogue, clearly in the grip of some sort of nostalgic imperial hubris.
Well, I think that the escalation of the war in Ukraine 3 years ago made everybody think about their security in a completely new way. This is not something, this is not the world of, in which the Cold War ended in 1989 or 1981 or whenever you date it from. And this was not the world as it was supposed to be 3 decades later. Nor is, as we've already discussed this evening, the United States seeking to redefine its role in European security, one that it's held for the last 80 years. So, of course, every country is looking to its own security. Every country in Europe, without exception, is talking about increases in its defence budget. So in that sense, it really fits the pattern. And of course, these two countries are of course, both members of NATO and in that sense are allies at a time when the alliance has got bigger questions than it has ever faced, possibly since it was founded in 1949. So it's perfectly natural that countries within whatever alliances and where they still seek these partnerships are seeking to establish their own, defence resources on the firmest possible footing.
Well, let's go to South Korea now, the high school students of which are being increasingly deprived of the field trip. This is not because, as might be understandably assumed, students have reached a frankly overdue consensus that they may be the only more tiresome expenditure of a day than being in the classroom, but because teachers are increasingly wary of the legal difficulties which may beset them if something goes awry. The key moment was a dreadful accident in 2022 when a student on an outing was knocked down and killed by a bus. The teacher supervising got 6 months for occupational negligence. James, do we sympathise here with the wary teachers? Only apparently 45% of Korean teachers are planning a field trip this year, even though reforms to that particular law have been promised.
Yeah, I think we do sympathise with the wary teachers. I also slightly sympathise with you, Andrew. It sounds like you had some bad field trips in high school when you're comparing it to the dullness of a day in the classroom. But to be serious, there is a very serious point here. I think this is a tremendously important part of education, actually. And although I teach at a university, not at a school, I do try to take my students out once or twice a year to go to exhibitions, for example. Not least because, I think I'm very aware that I'm teaching a generation who had their high school education disrupted by the pandemic. And I really want to try and get people out and about.
A fair and noble point, James, but would you still be as keen, or maybe it does, you're about to tell me, if you had to go through a field trip safety manual with a 90-item checklist before you took your students off campus?
Certainly not, and that's why I have a great deal of sympathy for the teachers. And I feel, one really feels for this teacher how, as I say, my students are all legal adults. I don't teach anybody under the age of 18, and many of them quite a bit older than that. So it's very different matter than taking primary school kids on a field trip, for example.
I did want to broaden this conversation out, Evdoxia, to talk about field trips that we may or may not remember. And I'm excited to have somebody from Greece here, especially because I was at the Parthenon as recently as Sunday morning, which, as I'm sure you know, is absolutely overrun with school groups from all over the world. And when I say school groups, I mean groups of kids just gawping into their phones and paying absolutely no attention while their teacher tries to interest them in 2,500 years of Western civilization. But what was a Greek field trip like? Did you get taken to see all this stuff?
Oh, yeah, that's a nice question, actually. It takes me back to my school years. Well, when I was finishing school, I was, what's the equivalent, like 17 years old? What's the equivalent class here?
Sixth form A levels, I guess, end of high school,
yes,
I guess.
Yes, end of high school. We went for 5 days in Corfu. So I was...
How awful.
Yeah, it was crazy. Yeah, it was crazy. Now I feel sorry for my teachers.
Yeah, did anybody learn anything? Was my follow-up question.
I don't know if anybody learned, but I saw very
beautiful.
beautiful.
Not necessarily to do with the curriculum they learned.
Yes, we saw, but it was educated because we saw something we hadn't seen before. At least I hadn't. They took us to some sightseeings. That we learned about Corfu, and we learned how nice wine Corfu has. And
okay, you were having a lot more fun on your field trips than I ever did on mine. James, did you get taken to see exotic ruins and plied with wine in the sunshine, or not so much?
No, not at my school so much. No, we went to the theatre. I studied languages and literature for my final exams before I went to university, so we did go to the theatre sometimes, but no, there was no sunshine and no wine. I went to school in Manchester, there's not much sunshine there at the best of times, so...
They didn't even take you to look at a canal or anything?
No, we saw those quite a lot all the time, to be honest. They were,
I guess so.
They don't take you out of the country.
Sometimes, actually, but I must confess, I didn't go on any of the foreign trips. They were very expensive, actually, so I didn't. Wasn't something that I did. But I made up for it by travelling a lot since, I'm pleased to say.
Well, on that slightly heartwarming note, James Rogers and Evdoxia Limperi, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it is our weekly letter from, and this week it's from Laura Kramer in Denver.
I recently flew more than 7,000 kilometers from London to Denver. The official reason was to see my mom and brother. Unofficially, I was there on a sicker mission. A ritual, if you will, that I do every time I'm back in the US, which is to scout out the best all-you-can-eat Asian buffets and stuff myself silly on an American Chinese classic, General Tso's chicken. You see, I grew up in Iowa, a place where all-you-can-eat Asian buffets are everywhere. I won't assume what that says about the good people of my hometown in Dubuque, but now my family's in Colorado, and I figured Denver, being a bigger city, would be crawling with them. Or so I thought. Instead, I ate Mexican food. A lot of Mexican food, tamales, tacos, a torta the size of a baby. But while I was guzzling margaritas, hushed conversations at the table next to me were of a simmering dis-ease that had spread across the city, indeed the nation. Just a few miles away, federal immigration officers were conducting raids. One in February had swept through apartment buildings in southeast Denver and neighboring Aurora. ICE said they were targeting violent gang members, a Venezuelan group called Tren de Aragua, which the State Department has designated as a terrorist organization. It's part of a promise President Donald Trump had made on the campaign trail a month before election when he announced Operation Aurora.
These towns have been conquered. I will liberate Colorado. I will give you back your freedom and your life.
Despite the local-sounding name, the operation was a nationwide crackdown named after the Colorado city that became ground zero for its debut. Denver and its surrounding areas had historically been a welcoming place for undocumented migrants from south of the border. Locals, though, were divided. Some said the city was stretched too thin. One think tank estimated the Denver region had spent more than $200 million supporting recent migrants since 2022. Amid a cost of living crisis, the price tag seemed too high, even for some liberals. A ramp-up of deportation efforts are reshaping Colorado's economy and its streets. A friend tells me business is down at some local shops. People are scared. They're staying home, taking side streets, skipping grocery runs. At a hospital, nurses gossip about the raids. Rumors swirl. Neighbors tipping off ICE on one side, planned raids being leaked or sabotaged on the other. People are pushing back. Protests broke out across the country. In Colorado, the biggest crowds gathered in Denver.
This is what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! Show us what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like!
There's so many things that are disturbing that it's hard to choose one thing. to protest. It's been overwhelming.
So in the end, I never did find the all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet. But I found something else, a city in flux, full of warmth, full of fear. People sharing a meal while whispering about ice raids between tables. Denver wasn't what I came looking for, but maybe I was looking in the wrong places. Because the reason there are so many great Mexican restaurants here is the same reason this city's at the center of a national fight. People come here to work, to raise kids, to build lives, and they brought their food with them. The Mile High City is shaped by immigrants. You can taste it in every bite. For Monocle Radio, I'm Laura Kramer.
Thank you, Laura. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Evdoxia Limperi and James Rogers. Today's show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Francesca Jilks. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.